Hello and welcome to this third chapter, data visualization. So today we'll be talking about how to present data in a form that's much easier to read for the user. The main thing you want to watch out for is you don't want to make it too simple, but then you don't also want to make it too complicated where people get lost in the numbers and get lost in what you're trying to convey. Data visualization can be as simple as just creating tables from your data, or what you've learned in your previous MIS class, creating charts that will help you interpret, analyze, and learn from the data. So you need to think about what is it that you want to show, and then use the correct type of chart for that. We can also use our data visualization, especially charts, to identify data errors, things that are outliers, and we can also help reduce the size of your data, especially when you're looking at relationships. And so if you see some data, some fields, so to speak, that correlate well with another column, then you might be able to take that other column out because they're representing the same data. They have the same variance, so to speak. So the first thing we want to talk about is some effective design techniques. And what your book talks about is something called a data to ink ratio. So you don't want to use a lot of ink if it's not necessary. It could take away from what the user really needs to see. So the data ink ratio talks about the ink that's used in your table or your chart, and you just want to use enough to convey the information or meaning of what that table or chart is showing to the user. So here's an example where we have a table that has a low data to ink ratio. So these grid lines may not be adding any information. We have a similar example here in the chart where these horizontal lines may not be offering any information as well. So we can increase that data to ink ratio by removing those grid lines. And so you can see we're presenting that information and we can see it just fine. We don't need those extra lines of ink in there. Similarly, we can do the same thing with a chart. Just make sure that when you're doing charts, they always have a title. They have the units of measurement for the vertical axis. Typically that's the y-axis, and your x-axis, which is the horizontal axis. So let's go ahead and get specific about tables now, and we'll go ahead and move into that part of the chapter. So the question is, when should you use tables? Tables are necessary when the reader needs to look at specific numerical values. So I want to see some kind of comparison and I need to see exact values. Also, when you need to make those comparisons and it's not just a relative comparison. And then lastly here, think about it when you have different units that you need to look at and have may have different magnitudes. And so if something's high, you've got one measurement that has high values, and then you got something else that you're measuring along that, and it's got smaller values, but you need to see how they might vary as you go from one row to another. So an example might be when you're looking at your costs and your revenues and you want to see how that varies from month to month. So you can actually see the values here, see what the totals are, and that makes for a nice comparison. Notice how there's little ink that could have been in there if you had an extra line there. So that was taken out. So if that data were put into a graphical form, you can see how it would look here, but it's kind of hard to tell exactly what the differences between revenue and costs are We don't know how much that revenues exceed expenses each month. And so this would be better presented in a table. And it might be easier if you have the graph here, but then you also put the numbers below that so that the reader can actually see the differences from month to month. Now, earlier we mentioned, what if the magnitude of what you're presenting is different from the other values for the other items you're looking at? So an example here might be the head count. We'd like to know how many employees or some number that varies as we're looking at costs and revenues. And so here we have a very small number, which would mean nothing on a graph, or it'd be hard to say that has much impact. But we can see here that maybe having more people impacts the costs and revenues of the organization. Those sort of changes would be hard to detect on a chart or interpret correctly. Some principal design for tables is try not to use vertical lines in your table unless it's absolutely necessary for clarity. And you typically would only use horizontal lines that are useful for separating column titles from your data values, or when some type of a calculation takes place. So here we have different table designs. What some research has suggested is that table design D with the fewest grid lines is the easiest to read. And it also follows the principles that were suggested on the previous slide. So we're just using horizontal lines to distinguish between the title and data points, and we've omitted all the different vertical lines except where there's been some kind of calculation. Here we have another table, and it's a larger table, and so when the user has to scan across the screen, it's useful to alternate the colors or shading that you have between columns. Allows them to know which column they're looking at. Notice we've got a horizontal line here to separate the titles of our columns from the actual values. Also a line here near the bottom right before total, so that we've done some kind of calculation that signals that to the user as well. And I keep using user and reader interchangeably, and I will continue to do that. So I just want to make sure that you understand that's what I'm doing. Another thing to point out on this table is that numbers should be right aligned. So that makes it easier to tell the differences in magnitude between the numbers going from row to row or within the row. If you're going to use decimal places, make sure you use decimal places the same for every number so that it's consistent. Typically also you'll left align your text values over here in this column, and the heading values should match the way you've aligned your columns of numbers or be centered. Continuing on to the continuation of that table, we see that again we're still alternating the shading in our columns. We have another vertical line here because now we're doing totals here, and we're still following the principles that we did in the first part of this table. Another type of table that you might run into is something called a cross-tabulation table. And this is when you're summarizing two variables against each other and seeing what matches up. So it might be like females that smoke versus males that smoke versus females that don't smoke versus males that smoke. So that's a cross-tabulation. And you'd have a frequency or a count inside of each one of those little cells. Now, what we've done in Excel that you may have seen is when you do a pivot table. And so this is a cross tabulation table. It's actually getting those values for you and comparing the different variables and getting the frequency or counts of each one of those variables according to how you've got it laid out. So here we have a table that's showing the meal price for 300 Los Angeles restaurants and their quality rating. So we've got the restaurants, we've got their quality rating, the meal price, and their wait times. And so from there, we'll do some cross tabulation. So the cross tabulation here is the quality rating by meal price, and we're going to break the meal price down into these ranges or bins. And then we can get a count in each one of those. So additionally, this is showing us that we have 84 restaurants that have a good rating, 150 have a very good rating, and 66 which have an excellent rating. So that's where we get this 300 from. Then we can break it down by meal price, and again, this is all going to add up to 300 again. So the data would have come from an Excel spreadsheet, and it probably would have been laid out similar to what you see on the screen. Again, we've got our 1 through 300 restaurants here, the quality rating, the meal price, and the wait time. So the formulas and practice questions you did in the last chapter would allow you to generate that previous table. But in this chapter, we can generate that table using a pivot table. And so the pivot table, it gives you how to do that in Excel. So you would open up the restaurant table, you'd click on Insert, generate a pivot table, and so on. So I'll walk through that here in a moment, but I just wanted to show you the different aspects of the pivot table. So once you click on the Insert tab, you're going to get a ribbon up there, and you can click on Tables. You're going to say Create Pivot Table. From there, it'll generate something like you see on the screen. You will have to, if you haven't selected the table or range before you do that, you'll have to choose that while you're creating that pivot table. And it'll look something like you've got here. Notice that right here, it's showing you all your field names or your variable names you have, and then you can generate, okay, what do I want to go in the rows? What do I want to go in the columns? And then that cross tabulation, what is it that I want here under values? So typically under values, the default is going to be a sum, but you could get a count, which would be the sum again, but you could get an average, you could get a standard deviation. It just depends on what kind of numbers that you've got there. So once you select everything, notice here we're doing the quality rating it goes into the rows, the columns are the meal price, and then we have a count of your restaurants here. And so it generates these values. Now, something you probably didn't do when you were in your Excel class is that you generated groups, and so we can actually select a group from our list of options, and then we'll do our grouping, and then we can say what we're going to start at. And as you can see in the screen, we have our 10 to 19, 20 to 30, 20 to 29, and so on. And I'll show you how to do that here shortly. And then we can also change that to percent frequencies if you want. And all you're doing is just following along what you've got in the book. I would suggest that after you see me do it, you go ahead and do it yourself. And here we have the final report, I believe, for restaurant data with the average wait times. So we're not going to do the sum of wait times, but we're going to put in the average wait times there. All right, so let me go ahead and open up that particular spreadsheet, and we'll walk through creating a pivot table. Okay, I've opened up that restaurant spreadsheet that has the data in it. I typically like to go ahead and highlight all my field names and then all of my data. So we got 300, so it's going to take me a moment here. If you'll bear with me. Once I get to 300, you'll see that on the screen. So I'm going to just go to the end. So now I'm going to go to the Insert, and I need to move that down just a little so you can see it. I'm going to go to the Insert tab, and we've got Pivot Table here. So once I do that, then it's going to ask me, select the table or range. So this is where your book would have had you type in that range. I just like to highlight it first, and that way I know I've got everything. And then we're going to do a new worksheet, and we're going to click OK. So notice, I'm going to shrink this down a little. Notice that my pivot table information comes up over here on the side. And I should be able to grab these and pull that out. And so because of my space or screen limitations, you don't see exactly what you do in the book, but it's very similar. All right, so we're going to build this cross tab, if you would. So we're going to drag quality rating to our rows. Notice that when I drag it, it automatically checks it. If you just checked it up here, it would have tried to assume where you want it to go. Let me show you where that is. So you'll notice that I drug it down here. Just literally grab, and drag and drop. And I'll show you how to do the second one. The second one is drag meal prices to our column. So you can see meal price now is in there. Then we need to do the sum of the restaurant values. So we're going to select the field settings. I guess we need to drag that down there first. So restaurant to the values column or panel. And we've got the sum and the values. So I'm going to click this. And instead of being, we're going to do value field settings. You'll see that come up. Instead of doing sum, we're going to do the count of the restaurants in there. Click OK. So you can see this panel right here, when you put it in here, these are the numbers that are generated. So in this meal price of $10, we have 6 that are good, 4 that are 11, but we're going to continue working on this, but I just want you to understand what you're seeing here. And we can also go all the way out to the end and we see what those totals are. But we're not quite done. So now we're going to create the grouping. So we're following along in your book. We'll do a right click here and you'll have this pop up on your screen. You want to select group. From there, you want to do a starting and ending ad. So in the start box, we're going to do 10. In the ending box, we're going to do 49. And we're going to go by 10. Right. We're going to click OK. So you see how that's automatically done for us. So we've got a window of 10. We started at 10, we're going to 49, and we're going to do increments of 10 inside each of these. And we're going to right click on Excellent in cell A5. And then we're going to select Move. And we're going to move Excellent to the end. So now we have good, very good, and excellent. All right, so we right-clicked on this to move these ratings around, and we right-clicked on this to set a group and how wide we want each of those groups. Again, you could have did the same thing if you knew bins, right? That's the same thing as the bins from the last chapter. So I'm going to move this back. I'm going to just get the arrows, click and hold, and just draw it back. And we can see now we have these values here. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is just show you how to do the percent frequency distribution. And so again, we'll go in, we'll get the fields back. Let me also show this. If this was turned off, that is, you don't have your fields, you're on this, you've come back, you're working on this again. To get those fields to show back up, you just need to click in the pivot table. I say that, it's not showing up now. So if that happens to you like it's happening to me, you may need to go up here to Show and then do the field list, and that would bring it back. So we're going to change this to percentages. So we'll click here where these values are, because that's the numbers that we want to change. So we click on those, and we're going to do the value field settings, customer name, and then we're going to click on this tab here, and it may be difficult to see, but this show value as. And then from there, we're going to click on this drop down box and say percent of grand total. And then we'll click OK. And so you can see what percentage there, if that's the way you want to look at your data. Again, that's going to give you some insight into how those restaurants were ranked. The next thing we're going to do is incorporate those wait times. So again, we get the pivot table back, we get the fields back, we look at the restaurant times, and we're looking at this count of restaurant here. And what we're going to do is do the drop down box, except this time we're going to remove the field. You can click on it or delete it if you want. Now we're going to drag the wait times down to here. And we're going to want these to be the average wait times. So we're going to select that. We're going to do value field settings and click on average. I just also mentioned that all of these values here, they're Excel functions, they're built into this pivot table, but these are also aggregate functions. So if you're ever dealing with databases, you might hear them referred to as aggregate functions, and you can see what kind of values they might produce here if you just look at them. But we're doing the average, so we'll click OK. And we can see that, you know, very large number of decimal places are in there. We can click on this again. We can go to our number format, and we can select 2 decimal places, and we'll click OK. And so now we have 2 decimal places for our wait times. Now it looks like it should be 1 decimal place. So to get back in there and do that again, we click on this value, click on our number format, select that to 1, click OK. Now there are other ways you could do this. You could have just highlighted all that area and gone to your home tab and selected, you know, the number 1 format. That's worked as well. Depending on how large your pivot table is, then you may want to do it the way we're showing you do it here. Now your book also talks about the ability for Excel to do a recommended pivot table, and so you may want to experiment with that as well. Just, you know, try and do different things and see what's available to you here. Notice that once the pivot table is done, you can do the analyze, you can do the design, and we can actually go in there and format it a little differently. Notice here when we talked about earlier, you know, when you're doing a table, do you want the shading to be different? We can change the colors if we want, so on. You Again, if you're not familiar with this, it's been a while since you've done pivot tables, click on these two tabs that are available to you when you do a pivot table and see what different things you might be able to do with your pivot table. So this ends this section on tables, and we'll come up and do the second part on charts in just a moment or two.